All right, this is your second set of notes for this unit. We're going to be talking about cnidarians. You should have picked up a handout when you came in. It's important that you don't just write what's on the screen. There's quite a few things for this set of notes that are going to be verbal only, and you're still responsible for those. So just make sure to add those in. Also, don't forget to add labels to some of the diagrams. You'll notice that they're blank on your handout. Okay, let's get started. So first of all, pronunciation. The C is actually silent for this phylum. It's tempting to call them cnidarians, but the C is silent, so it's actually just cnidarians. Okay, and a cnidarian is a soft-bodied carnivorous animal. It has stinging tentacles arranged in circles around their mouths. Okay, and so this phylum Cnidaria includes animals like hydras, jellyfishes, sea anemones, and corals. And we'll talk about those in a bit more detail later on. Okay, they're technically the simplest animals to have body symmetry, and we'll talk about what type of body symmetry, as well as specialized tissues. So certain tissues that do very particular jobs. Okay, cnidarians get their name from these special cells that they have called cnidocytes, and they're basically stinging cells. So they are customized or specialized to be able to either defend that cnidarian, defend the animal, or in a lot of cases use as a weapon to capture prey. And usually these stinging cells are located on their tentacles, on the tips of their tentacles, like you can see here. This is a tentacle zoomed up, and they're built into that outer wall called the epidermis. This is what one of them looks like. And then if this were a prey, you can see that they actually shoot these out, these special structures inside, out like a dart. Okay, that special structure is called a nematocyte. So here you can see, here's a cnidocyte, that specialized cell in the wall, in the outer surface of the cnidarian, and the nematocyst is inside. And it's this poison-filled kind of dart-like structure that if it gets brushed up against, maybe like a shrimp or a small fish brushes up against the tentacles, thousands of these little nematocytes explode into the animal and release enough poison to either paralyze it so it can be eaten or killed. Okay, now nematocysts are not really particular about what they sting. Pretty much if anything brushes up against them, they'll immediately fire and shoot this poison into whatever brushed up against it, which in a lot of cases is not good, especially if, you know, an unintended target like humans, or if you've ever heard of, if hopefully no one here has ever gotten stung by a jellyfish, but when someone gets stung by something like a jellyfish or a sea anemone, that's basically what's happened. They've brushed up against it, and those little nematocysts kind of release that poison and sting that person, maybe a swimmer or a surfer. Okay, so cnidarians are radially symmetrical. So if you recall, that means that you could divide them in any number of planes, more than 2 planes. It would always make 2 equal halves. Okay, especially if you're looking at them like inferiorly from above. Okay, so they are radially symmetrical, and for the most part, cnidarians have 2 stages to their life cycle. So they have a polyp stage, which looks like this. Most cases looks like this, and then a medusa phase, which in most cases looks like that. Okay, and a polyp is a cylindrical body, so you can see this area right here, for the most part, is the main body of the polyp, and then it has lots of arm-like tentacles. Usually those arms are upwards, okay? And I know it's not labeled on here, but right here would be like the mouth. Okay, so mouths of polyps tend to point upwards, and these tentacles will actually provide food or carry food to the mouth to feed the polyp. Polyps tend to be sessile. So remember, sessile means that they're stationary. Once they're anchored in place, they pretty much don't move, just like how sponges are sessile. The other stage, next slide, is medusa. Now, medusa is motile, so it is mobile. It moves around, and it's usually a bell-shaped body. The mouth is aimed more towards the bottom, so this is actually the mouth right here. If you wanted to add a label there, you can. And then the tentacles tend to point downwards as well. Okay, so whether we're dealing with polyps or with medusas, both of these forms do have some kind of body wall, like you can see here, surrounding an internal space. So you can see it here in the polyp. This is the internal space. For the medusa, you have the outer body wall and then an inner kind of internal space. And that internal space is what we call a gastrovascular cavity. And that's where pretty much the digestion of food takes place. So it's not as complex as, let's say, a digestive system and a stomach, but it does a similar function. Okay. Also, I know I don't have it on here, but I'll write those terms up on the front board. You should also make a note here that the outermost surface of the body wall is what we call the epidermis. Okay, so just like the epidermis of a leaf when we learned about botany, epidermis just means like outer dermis, outer skin. And then usually there's a middle area called a mesoglia. And again, I'll put that term up on the front board. Okay, and that, in terms of spelling, if you need the spelling, but mesoglia is the layer that lies between the epidermis and the gastrovascular cavity. So you can kind of see it as like the dark brown layer that you see, and then the grayish bluish layer that I'm pointing to, that would be the epidermis. Okay, in terms of response to environment, cnidarians have a very basic nervous system. It's not as complex as chordates, for example, where there's like a brain and an actual nervous system, but they do have something called a nerve net, which is this loosely organized collection or network of nerve cells. And these nerve cells are going to allow that cnidarian to detect stimuli, usually by touch. So if something brushes up against it, the nerve cells in that nerve net will detect it, and then the cnidarian responds in whatever way. Okay. In terms of reproduction, most cnidarians reproduce both sexually and asexually. So remember, sexually involves having male and female involved, whereas asexually can be done with just a single parent. Okay, and it depends on the stage. For the most part, when it comes to asexual reproduction, that's how the polyps, those younger forms, the sessile polyp stage, tends to reproduce this way. And all that really means is budding is really just when a polyp that's already existing grows another polyp off of it. So it kind of just like branches on a tree, the same sort of idea. Okay, so polyps reproduce this way, and the different polyps that are made this way end up being exactly identical to one another. Genetically, that asexual reproduction is just making exact copies of the original parent. Okay, so that's how they reproduce. However, once they get to the medusa stage, or in most other cnidarians where medusa stage exists, then that's where sexual reproduction happens. And this happens using external fertilization. So remember, fertilization is where a sperm cell and an egg cell come together to make a zygote. Well, in cnidarians, it's external, meaning it doesn't happen inside of the female's body. Instead, what happens is the sperm cells and egg cells are released into the water. And let's move on to the next slide to see what that looks like here. So here you have a female medusa and you have a male medusa. In this case, unlike with sponges where the individuals can be both male and female, when it comes to the Medusa stage, there's generally there are ones that are only strictly female and ones that are only strictly male. And so here we have Aurelia, the genus Aurelia. It's a type of common jellyfish. It's actually the type of thing that we're going to be dissecting next week. But what ends up happening is the females release eggs into the water, similar to this one. Maybe not as big as this. They're much smaller in real life compared to the actual body of the female. And then the male Medusa releases sperm cells, like you can see here. Both of these are haploid, and so they're released out into the water, and over time, eventually as they float around, hopefully they get in contact with one another, and when they come in contact with each other, that's where, and they combine, that's where you get fertilization. Okay, so it happens in the open water. Once they come together and fertilization happens, you end up with a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, and then that will eventually grow into a free-swimming larva, which is really quite tiny. It's really quite tiny compared to the full-size adult. But these swimming larvae are then going to kind of swim around in this young stage, and eventually that swimming larva, next slide, will get to some sort of surface where it can anchor itself. And when it anchors itself, and it won't move anymore from that point on. So it develops into a polyp. And there you go. You start back at the beginning again. Okay, that polyp will, get bigger. Eventually, it's going to bud. Like you can see here, these are some buds coming off of the polyp. Each one of these are genetically identical. And then eventually, some of these buds might get released into the water as young medusas and grow up to be the big medusa, the big adult form medusas that we saw at the beginning of this life cycle. Now, if you want to see the full image of this life cycle from start to finish, it is actually in your textbooks, which are under your seat. And so if you go to page 672 of your notebook, you can see, of your textbook, you can actually see the whole process there from start to finish. Okay, so that's a really quick rundown of some of the main characteristics of cnidarians. Now, in terms of types of cnidarians, there are a number of groups. So there are jellyfishes, and the majority of cnidarians fall in this group. There are hydras and their relatives, and sea anemones and corals. Okay, so let's go through these really briefly to finish up these notes. So jellyfish are under the class, this is pronounced Scyphozoa, and so the main characteristic of Scyphozoa, or jellyfish, is that, as you can see here, this jellyfish is mobile. Jellyfish spend the majority of their lives actually in the Medusa stage, so they don't really end up spending very much time as polyps. It's just for a brief moment, if at all. And the majority of their lifespan is in this mobile form. Okay, the next class is Hydrozoa, and these are hydras and their related animals. Now, hydras are different from the rest of the cnidarians because they actually don't have a Medusa stage at all. They pretty much just live as polyps, and solitary as well. They don't tend to live with like in a colony or something, like we'll see with corals and so on, sea anemones on the next slide. So hydras are kind of lone wolves. They anchor themselves to something that doesn't move, and they pretty much stay as polyps for the majority of their life. They'll reproduce asexually by making buds off of the main body, like you can see here. So this is another hydra that will eventually anchor itself and be its own solitary polyp as well. Okay. And then finally, the last kind of class would be sea anemones and corals. And these are in the class, it's pronounced Anthozoa. And corals and sea anemones are lumped in together. Their major characteristic is that they only stay in the polyp stage, so they don't really ever do the medusa stage. Yeah, they don't tend to go into the medusa stage, and they're pretty much just stationary. Uh, if you look at the arrangement of sea anemone, like this one right here, they tend to be a central body surrounded by tentacles, and you can see all the tentacles around the outside. Another common characteristic with sea anemones and corals, and I don't have it on the slide, but you should write it in, is that they are usually colonial. So you usually have several polyps living close together, close to one another. Okay, when it comes to coral, like you see here, coral is also unique in that these colonies of polyps, part of how they kind of create a place for them to live is they secrete this skeleton, and it ends up being secreted underneath them. And it tends to be made of things like either calcium carbonate or limestone. Limestone, that's what makes the coral reefs that we see, that we see images of, or hopefully some of you have seen a coral reef in person before. Okay, last slide. When it comes to these corals also, one thing to mention in terms of ecology is they play a huge role, just like sponges, they play a huge role in the ocean ecosystem, especially in shallow tropical areas. And their distribution is determined by three main variables. So temperature, usually they require much warmer temperatures, which is why you don't really see coral reefs in like cold waters or temperate waters. You tend to see them in tropical weather because they need warmer temperatures. They also rely heavily on water depth. They are not really found in the deeper water. And that also ties in with the fact that they rely a lot on light intensity. And the reason especially for these two is because a lot of reefs, and you should probably add this in, I don't have it on here, a lot of reefs need, coral need a lot of light because many of them have mutualistic relationships with photosynthetic algae. So if you recall, for photosynthesis, in order for that to take place, sunlight is needed. That's a main component. And so if the water is too deep, you would have poor light in deeper water. That wouldn't be enough light for the algae to make to convert sunlight into food. And corals rely on a lot of these algae in order to get nutrients, from that photosynthesis. Okay, so that's why we tend to see corals in very shallow waters. Okay, and I think that is it. All right, thanks everyone.